When did you receive your diagnosis of ADHD?
I think like 47.
How did it change things?
Well, it was amazing. I absolutely amazing. You were recently diagnosed, right?
Yeah.
Um, so it changed everything because I finally had an explanation for something about the way that my mind worked and the way that I felt that made me, for 47 years, feel like there was something defective about me. And I couldn't figure out what it was. And I was diagnosed the way that most women that are adults are diagnosed. And it goes a little something like this. You have a kid. So my husband and I have 3 children, and our youngest, Oakley, was this just amazing kind of casserole of things. And one of the things that is that he had a lot of trouble in school. We didn't even know that he couldn't read. I mean, talk about being a parent that's asleep at the wheel. We didn't find out that he couldn't read, Stephen, until he was in the 4th grade. And the reason why we didn't know, and the school didn't know, is because he had so overcompensated in the classroom by being so verbal. First kid with the hand up, blah, 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 like talking, that nobody knew that he was having trouble. And all of a sudden, the math problems get harder because they become word problems. All of a sudden, reading comprehension, and not to mention the fact that he also had dysgraphia, which basically means that it looked like he was writing with his feet. I mean, his handwriting was so bad. And I was befuddled by this because he could literally sit in front of the TV and play video games for hours and have hyper focus and all this dexterity. And so I just thought, oh, he's acting out. He can't stand school. So we have this great teacher in the public school system who says, you really need to get him tested. And I wouldn't test him in the school. And luckily, we were at a point where we could afford to go get, I think it's called a psychographic something. It's like a long word. And sure enough, the testing comes back. And the PhD neuropsych guy is like, yeah, well, he has profound dyslexia. He has profound dysgraphia. He has executive functioning issues, which is basically the conductor or the secretary in the brain sort of helping you stay organized and a couple steps ahead. He has ADHD. And as I'm reading through this report, I'm sitting in the pediatrician's office, Stephen, and I'm looking at this report and I'm reading it, and I look up at his pediatrician who I had become good friends with because we had 3 kids in the practice at this point. And I'm like, Mark, do you think maybe if I have ADHD? And he puts his paper down, Stephen, and he goes, do I think you have ADHD? Of course you have ADHD. You are the most ADHD parent in my entire practice. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, Mel, you're brilliant. And yet you never do what you say you're going to do. You will leave here and tell me you're going to call. You never call back. Your kids go years without coming in because you miss all their wellness appointments. You scramble every single year for the physicals that your kids need. And you beg us to take, it is clockwork. Of course you have ADHD. And I look at him, Stephen, and I'm like, why didn't you tell me? He said, because I'm not your doctor. And so I went and I got the testing, Stephen, and turns out, yes, ADHD, dyslexia, same profile as my son. And what was interesting about getting the diagnosis, because I didn't understand what ADHD was. I always thought that ADHD is that you can't pay attention.
Same.
That's not what it is at all.
Mm.
And so learning about what it is and learning that boys and girls present completely differently. So there's an entire generation of women, I don't know if you know this, but there's an entire generation of women called the lost generation. And what happened is when they were studying ADHD, I guess in the late 60s and early 70s, they only looked at boys. And so boys tend to show the symptoms of ADHD around the age of 7. And it typically is around the hyperactivity or the inability to kind of like focus and control their body movements. Girls, on the other hand, don't start displaying symptoms until about the age of 12. And the symptoms are very different. Girls become inattentive, but in a kind of daydreaming fashion. They become a little bit more disorganized, and they aim all of this back at themselves. And so as you become kind of more inward and you are inattentive and you're disorganized and you start to wonder what's wrong with you, and now plus the average age of girls for puberty is right around then too, so all this other stuff is starting to happen and hormones are starting to change. If you don't get properly diagnosed and treated, and by treated, I mean the whole array of things that you can do, whether you're talking about medication or just the different habits that you can have or systems that you can develop to support yourself. If you don't get properly tested and you don't address it, do you know what the number one thing that happens? You develop anxiety.
Oh, really?
Well, of course, because you're sitting in a classroom and you can't get yourself to focus and you're disorganized and you start to feel this sense of alarm that you're going to walk into a test and you're not going to be able to do it, that you're going to yet again open your locker and the stuff's going to fly everywhere, that yet again you're going to forget your friend's birthday or you're going to forget to do this thing. And so all of this anxiety rises to the surface. So get this. So they call us the lost generation of women because what do you suppose if we were not diagnosed? So I'm 55. If I'm in elementary school in the late 70s and and they've only studied boys, and so none of this is on anybody's radar screen, you now have a generation of women who are developing anxiety at big levels in high school and college. I was textbook. And so we get treated for the anxiety and medicated for it without addressing the underlying issue all along, which was undiagnosed ADHD. So for me, it was absolutely life-changing. And it was life-changing to understand that ADHD is not about your inability to focus. It is about the fact, and I'm sure you probably have dug into this and you know this, but for anybody, anytime I talk about this, the number of women that are going to write in, the number of dads that will write in about their daughters, the number of people that say, "Oh my God, I had anxiety in high school too, and now I've been diagnosed with ADHD, and it was because of my kid going through this, and this is exactly my story." It is happening over and over and over again. And so here's what really also helped me, Stephen, and it's this. Understanding that focus and the ability to focus in appropriate ways requires two different neural networks in your brain. And you can think about it this way. If you think about, the prefrontal cortex, this kind of part of your brain, really has the job of almost being like a conductor of an orchestra. This is the best example that I've heard in terms of what's happening if you have ADHD. And what's happening is if you think about an orchestra and the orchestra's warming up, right? And it's like, and the drums are ting, 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 and people are shuffling in their seats. We know that sound, right? And then all of a sudden, the conductor's like, tip, 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 tip. And everybody's silent, right? In order to conduct an orchestra, you got to be able to do two things at once. You got to be able to lower the volume on the strings over here. And then you got to be able to amplify the focus on the percussion over here. And what happens when this part of your brain is not switching properly is you are like Mel Robbins in college, and I would be with my books, and I would be in the stacks at Baker Library at Dartmouth College, and I'd be there because I'm going to study, right? And my orchestra conductor cannot shush anything. So the second I sit down, if I'm going to study, I have to do two things. I have to be able to quiet all the ambient noise. I have to be able to quiet all the signaling in my body so that I can amplify my attention on what I'm reading. When this part of your brain doesn't work, what ends up happening, or at least this is the way that it's been explained to me, is that I can't focus on my books because I'm paying attention to the fact that my stomach is grumbling and I hear people walking, and then I'm looking around, and then I'm paying attention to the fact that I have to go to the bathroom. So then I'm up, then I'm walking around. And that is how I lived for a very, very long time.
Do you think that's a survival response?
What do you mean?
Becoming very aware of your surroundings. You know what I mean?
Has anyone ever researched whether or not there's a link between trauma and ADHD?
Yes.
And
Gabor Mate, I believe, is the one that's made a pretty compelling case to me that ADHD appears to be linked to childhood trauma, which is I'm going to butcher this, so please forgive me, everybody. The case he made to me was that when you have a chaotic or traumatic or stressful childhood, as a survival mechanism, you learn to tune out. And that's protective. So if your parents are always screaming in the house, for example, it makes a lot of sense for you to learn to tune out in that moment, but also to know when to tune in obsessively. And maybe that's the hyperfocus bit. The bit that he really stressed to me was that kids that go through some kind of interpretation of a stressful environment at a young age or a traumatic environment are more likely to have ADHD because they've learned to tune out in order to sort of conserve and survive. It's like my rough understanding of it.
Well, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you also have a really chaotic environment, it might not be safe for you to tune out.
Yeah.
And so you've got to stay in that hypervigilant mode, which I think would fry the conductor in your brain.
It does, yeah.
Because you're both paying attention to the survival signals in your body at the same time as the chaos in your house. And even if you're tuning out the parents who are screaming at each other, you are still tuned into it because heaven forbid it escalates.
Yeah.
You got to know.
Yeah.
And so I think it makes perfect sense, honestly. But it was just a game changer. And it was a game changer to know kind of the distinction between boys and girls and the link with anxiety in terms of it developing in a pronounced way for those of us that have had this experience of having this as a diagnosis, learning it late in life, and then tracing it back and going, oh my God, I've been treated for anxiety for all these years when the real issue was this attention issue. And if you take Gabor Mate's theory, which I think is probably accurate, dial it back even further, and it's probably some form of childhood trauma that put a kink in the wires. I have been dying to share a deeply personal story with you. I was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 47. And I wanted to talk to you about it because I'm not the only person who's been diagnosed late in life with ADHD. In fact, researchers say this is very common with women. And there's an entire generation of women, they've labeled them the lost generation, who have struggled with ADHD their entire lives and never even knew it. And I was one of them. And you may be one of them too. And when I was finally diagnosed, this was just 6 years ago, and I'm going to tell you the whole story about how I got diagnosed because it was by mistake. But when I finally got that diagnosis, it was both a blessing and a curse. It was a blessing because I finally understood all the things that I had struggled with for my entire life. And here's why it was a curse. It was a curse because once I understood the impact of living with undiagnosed ADHD on women in particular, I couldn't help but reflect back on the past 47 years where I was living my life. I had ADHD. I wasn't treated for it. I didn't know it. I felt so much grief about the amount of struggles that I had. And I wondered, things could have been really different. If somebody had figured this out when I was really little, if I had gotten the interventions that really helped someone like me, I know I wouldn't have struggled with anxiety or did some of the things I deeply regret for more than 30 years. That's how big of a deal this has been in my life. And so today we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. You're going to learn the 4 key differences about how ADHD affects boys and girls, and you're going to understand the reason why women go profoundly undiagnosed. You'll learn the surprising way most women find out that they have ADHD, and you're also going to hear about the connection between anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and living with undiagnosed ADHD. And you will get a lot of good news, because there is good news. And there's a lot that you can do to support yourself if you or someone you love have ADHD. And I'm going to focus on the impact on women, but you might not be a woman. I mean, we're in 194 countries at this point with the Mel Robbins podcast. We have fans across the entire gender spectrum, but I want you to listen, and here's why. You know women and girls in your life. And when you hear what I'm about to explain to you, this will help you understand and empower your sister, your partner, your daughter, your girlfriend, your niece, anybody that you know, because this conversation today is going to be full of resources that will help you empower yourself or other people in your life who have either been diagnosed or who haven't been diagnosed and are wondering, what the hell is wrong with me? Because that's basically how I felt for the first 47 years of my life. What the fuck is wrong with me? This is something that happened to me 6 years ago, and it changed the trajectory of my life. It's a story about our son, Oakley. He was in the 4th grade, and I was 47 years old, and he was really struggling in school. And we went through the testing that so many of us go through with our kids whenever they're struggling in school to find out, what are we dealing with? What is the casserole of the brain that is Oakley Robbins? And the school was trying to tell us that he was having all kinds of behavioral issues. He was interrupting class. He was fidgety. He didn't pay attention, blah, 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 blah. But we knew something was up. And luckily, this was at a time in our life where we could afford to go outside the school and get a neuropsych exam. Huge shout out to Dr. Moldover, the GOAT in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And sure enough, he did a neuropsych on our son, Oakley. And the findings were very conclusive. He had profound dyslexia. He had dysgraphia, which is kind of related to dyslexia. These are both language-based learning styles based on your neural pathway development in the brain. And the other thing he was diagnosed with is ADHD. And when I started reading the report, because when you get these assessments done, and I'm sure a ton of you have had this experience either with your kids, or maybe it happened to you when you were a kid, or with nieces or nephews. This is super common for people to go through this. When we got the big report kind of telling us all about Oakley's brain, I was sitting with this pediatrician, Dr. Blumenthal, and I'd known Mark for, 16 years at this point. And we're flipping through the thing, and Mark's going, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, and we were going to talk options about what we could do in terms of therapy or medication, or, ways that we could support Oak now that we had a diagnosis about both his learning style, but more importantly, about this attention issue. And I kind of looked at Mark and I said, as I'm reading this, Mark, this sounds a lot like me. Do you think that maybe I have ADHD? And Dr. Blumenthal, I just love this guy. He leans back in his chair and he looks at me with this sort of stunned look on his face. And he's like, do I think you have ADHD? Mel Robbins, of course you have ADHD. In fact, you're probably the most ADHD parent I have in my entire practice. You are so successful and you are a complete bird brain. Do you realize that you will go years and not bring your kids in for their wellness appointments? In fact, every fall we have a joke. We know that you are going to be one of those 20 parents that call in a fucking panic because you need a physical. You need a physical. Your kid's practice starts tomorrow. You need a physical. And now it's a 5-alarm fire, but you've missed their wellness appointment. And you do it every year. And you'll leave every exam and you'll go, oh yeah, okay, I'll follow up. I'll call you tomorrow. I'll tell you about it. You never do. And I just looked at him and I said, and as he was talking, because I knew he was right, I always felt so incompetent about my ability to keep up with appointments or to remember things like that or any of it. And then he goes, so do I think you have ADHD? Of course you have ADHD. And I looked him square in the eye, you guys, and you know what I said to him? Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me I had ADHD? And he goes, I'm not your doctor, Mel. I'll tell you, I was 47 years old when I realized that what I had been dealing with for my entire life may not be anxiety. It might just be fucking ADHD. And so I went to my primary care. She referred me to a specialist. Sure enough, just like my son, dyslexia, ADHD. And I have since learned because, once something happens in my life, I am like a truffle pig rooting for a truffle. I literally start digging until I find something. And I made it my mission 6 years ago to find out everything I could possibly discover about ADHD. Not only because I wanted to help our son Oakley and eventually our daughter Kendall and our daughter Sawyer, but also because now that I understood that I had this diagnosis, I wanted to understand what the hell was going on so I could help myself. And what I learned is incredible. I am part of a lost generation of women who were diagnosed with anxiety or depression or an eating disorder or some other condition in my teens and 20s, when the underlying problem all along was that they missed the diagnosis of ADHD. And that's why I want to talk to you about it. I have wanted to have a conversation with you about this ever since we started this podcast 8 months ago, but I have been reluctant to do it because I wanted to make sure I had resources to give you. Because every time I've talked about this on YouTube or on social, or I've talked about it on a talk show, we receive an avalanche of inbound stories, requests for information. And so I didn't want to unpack everything I'm going to share with you today until I knew I could point you in the right direction. And what we're going to talk about today is really important. It's really important because what the research shows is that when you are not properly diagnosed with ADHD and you have it, the outcomes for girls in particular are horrendous. And the word horrendous is a word that one of the world's leading experts uses, not me. Let me just read this to you. This comes from Dr. Ellen Littman, who's a clinical psychologist, co-author of Understanding Girls with ADHD, and this is what she said. Anxiety and depression turn into low self-esteem, self-loathing, and the risk for self-harm and suicide attempts is 4 times higher for girls with ADHD than girls without. That's terrifying. So the conversation that we're going to have today, it goes way beyond having trouble with homework or having trouble focusing. We'll cover all of this. But I personally believe, as I sit here and I look back on my life, I'm now 53 years old. I was diagnosed with ADHD late at the age of 47, 6 years ago. I look back on my life and I know that I would not have struggled with anxiety the way that I did had I been properly diagnosed, medicated, and treated for ADHD when I was little. Full stop. And so if you're somebody that has struggled with low self-esteem, self-loathing, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, you got diagnosed in your teens and your 20s, and you can't seem to turn the corner on this, I truly want you to consider what I'm about to share with you, what I've learned in the last 6 years of researching this extensively, talking to the world's leading experts about this, among them Dr. Ned Hollowell, who wrote Driven Distraction. He's like the OG of ADD research. He's at Harvard. He's a world-renowned psychologist, Dr. Daniel Amen, who has scanned my brain and taught me all kinds of stuff about what he sees when he does a brain scan of somebody with ADHD. This is not about organization. ADHD, the definition of ADHD, and this was new to me. ADHD is a chronic neurobiological disorder which affects the brain's structural and chemical capabilities. It impacts the various parts of the brain and the way that your brain communicates with one another. And it is also highly inheritable. And there is good news here. There's a lot of good news that you're going to learn. But here's what we're going to cover, okay? Because this is not just like, hey, let's get some Adderall and party longer. This is a very serious issue, particularly for women, because we are profoundly underdiagnosed. So today, what I'm going to share with you is the 6 surprising signs that I didn't know, that I had all 6 of them, that could be signs that you, too, have adult ADHD. We're going to talk about why women were so profoundly underdiagnosed and have been profoundly underdiagnosed for decades. We're going to talk about the mental health implication when you're not properly diagnosed and when you don't seek either therapeutic or occupational or some sort of medicine treatment for it. You're going to learn about the 4 key differences between how ADHD presents in boys and girls. And we're going to talk about what to do if you think this is you. And finally, we're going to get into what's actually happening in your brain when you have ADHD, because this is so fascinating. I'm going to use a very physical metaphor for you that will have you completely understand this and why this is such a huge issue. And maybe the first place to start is, why are so many women underdiagnosed? Why does this go missing in girls? Well, the answer is this. When they first made ADHD a diagnosis back in the late 70s, they only studied boys. That's it. They only studied boys. And boys present very differently than girls. They have totally different symptoms typically. And this is really important to understand, because when I first heard the term ADHD, I thought of our son. Our son is like the poster boy for ADHD symptoms. Leg is jittery, hands are fidgeting, raising the hand, bumping up and down, got to run to the bathroom, bopping around, highly distracted. But what always confused me about him is that he could also laser focus on video games. So I sort of dismissed ADHD because I'm like, well, he can focus on video games, so it must be about his interest in things. No. ADHD has both physical symptoms that you see on the surface, and those are typically what's present in boys. But the reason why girls went profoundly misdiagnosed is because girls typically do not present those physical, jittery, interrupting kind of physical chaos. And boys present 4 key differences with ADHD than girls do. Here they are. Number 1, when a boy has ADHD, they have symptoms that appear on the surface: impulsive behavior, fidgeting, getting distracted, being very physical with their inability to concentrate. Girls, we have the opposite symptoms. Ours are all internal. We're restless, we daydream, we're hard on ourselves, we're forgetful, we're disorganized, and we start to aim it at ourselves as a character flaw. So when you're a girl with ADHD, you daydream. You're disorganized. You're hard on yourself. You make careless mistakes. You might be called a tomboy or super creative. But what happens, and this is why this is so scary, and this is what happened to me, is that when you sit in life or in a classroom and you see all your friends turning things in on time or staying organized, or their lockers are clean and yours is a mess and you're running late, and you start to think you have a character defect. You start to think there's something wrong with you. So you turn it back on yourself. And so that's what happened to me. And it also gets missed because it's internal. We're not sitting there bouncing our leg and jumping and raising our hand. We have the opposite impact. The second key difference between boys and girls is that boys present earlier, typically around the age of 7. Girls, however, present later, on average, like around 12. The third reason why there's a big difference between girls and boys is because boys wear it on their sleeve. They're very physical. They're fidgety. They're frustrated by it. They have trouble controlling their physical outbursts, whereas girls are excellent at hiding this. Why? Well, because we feel the pressure to conform. We feel like something's wrong with us. We do our best to cope. We do our best to look around and see what everybody else is doing. And we start working harder to compensate for what we feel is a character default in us, that we are lesser than, that we're not good enough, that everybody else seems to get this but me, and we hide it. And here's the big fucking difference between girls and boys with ADHD. Boys tend to get better. Girls get worse. And that is exactly what happened to me. I got way worse. Way worse. What goes from daydreaming, following instructions, making careless mistakes, forgetfulness, all-nighters, not being able to stay organized, that chronic struggle turns into, I'm fucked up, there's something wrong with me, and a profound correlation between anxiety, depression, eating disorders, suicidal thoughts. This is not just me, by the way. Let me pull some of the research out because this shit is scary. You can hear me flipping through my papers. I prepared for this because I wanted you to have women with ADHD face the feelings of being overwhelmed and exhausted the same way that men do. However, women increasingly have psychological distress, feel inadequate, low self-esteem, chronic stress. This is extremely common. You feel that your life is out of control or chaos, and daily tasks start to seem impossibly huge. Research shows that ADHD materializes dramatically differently in girls. And one clinical psychologist, Dr. Ellen Littman, this should scare you, says, she wrote the book Understanding Girls with ADHD. The outcomes for girls are horrendously negative compared to boys because ADHD materializes dramatically differently in girls as they get older. Anxiety and depression turn into low self-esteem and self-loathing. That happened to me. And the risk for self-harm and suicide attempts, 4 to 5 times greater for girls with ADHD. This is not about having trouble with homework. This is not about remembering birthdays. Because unlike boys, many of whom just show hyperactivity, girls' symptoms veer inward. And that means we aim all this at ourselves. And that's where the anxiety comes in. That's where the depression comes in. That's where the eating disorders come in. That's where the self-harm come in, is because you actually believe something's wrong with you. And here's what I'm here to say. There's nothing wrong with you. Absolutely nothing wrong with you. In fact, ADHD has a high correlation to being a successful entrepreneur, to being highly creative, to being a problem solver, a risk taker. There is so much beauty in this. But you also need to understand if you're dealing with a neurobiological disorder, which impacts your prefrontal cortex. Most girls that have undiagnosed ADHD, you know what they start to have on the surface? Anxiety. Because of course, if you're going to go into school every day and you're disorganized and you make careless mistakes and you're hard on yourself and you start to tell yourself there's something wrong with you, of course you're going to feel anxious about going. And it makes perfect sense, right? And if you can't control your ability to pay attention to things, a lot of us start seeking other things we can control. And that's why there are so many co-diagnoses with ADHD and eating disorders and anxiety and depression with girls. And that's exactly what happened to me. In fact, I was treated for decades for anxiety, and I am sitting here telling you right now, I 100% believe the issue I had all along was very simple. I had dyslexia and ADHD, and nobody fucking knew it. And instead, I developed anxiety. Why? Because that's what happens when you have undiagnosed ADHD and dyslexia and you don't understand why your brain doesn't work the same way as everybody else. You don't understand why you're always late, why you can't get it together, why things are always a mess, why there's clutter around you, why you're constantly missing deadlines or doctor's appointments or leaving your Kleenex on the counter, or you can't forget that. It's relentless. And so, of course, anxiety would develop. And I'm on a mission today to share absolutely everything that I have learned in my own deeply personal research to be a better mother of kids with ADHD and to be a better partner to myself as I live my life as an adult with ADHD. And what I've learned is life-changing. There are things that you can do. There are very surprising signs that this may be something for you. And I need to say right up front, I'm not a doctor. The purpose of this episode is not meant to diagnose you at all. I am here to entertain you with my story, and I am here to educate you based on my personal experience, and I am here to empower you to know that this is a reality for so many women in particular in the world, so that if it rings true for you, you go seek the professional help that's out there to get a very clear answer of what's happening for you. That's what this is about, because that's how you create a better life. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to learn from you, Dr. Palmer. And so why don't we start at just the basic level? What is ADHD?
So ADHD is a condition that has to begin before age 12. And has to last at least 6 months. Right now, the diagnostic criteria require that symptoms must have begun before age 12. It doesn't mean that anybody recognized them. It doesn't mean that anybody diagnosed them or treated them. But the symptoms fall into two main categories. One is inattention, and the other is hyperactivity or impulsivity. So it's kids who have trouble paying attention. They have trouble sitting still. They don't like to read books so much. They have trouble focusing on hard, difficult tasks. Sometimes they have trouble even playing with other kids quietly. They're the ones running around, fidgeting, knocking things down, climbing all over things. They can be the life of the party when there's a party, but when people are expecting peace and quiet, it's not a party anymore, and they can be seen as hyperactive or disruptive.
I read in my own research that the way that symptoms appear can be very different for boys and girls. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It can be. So traditionally, most people think of boys as having more of the hyperactive and impulsive symptoms. And so those are easier to recognize and diagnose because you see it. They're running around, they're getting into trouble.
It's the leg going.
They're falling down, they're fidgeting, all of that stuff. It's obvious. The teachers think of it as a problem because these are the kids that are talking in class, blurting out answers, not waiting their turn in line when it's, time to go to the recess or time to switch classrooms. So they're often seen as discipline problems, and so they often get recognized and then treated. For the people who have primarily the inattentive type of ADHD, which tends to be more girls, but boys can have it as well, if they don't really have many of the symptoms of impulsivity or hyperactivity, they can be unrecognized and unnoticed. And they just have trouble focusing on tests. They have trouble paying attention when they read. They may not remember everything that they just read. They have to work harder. And if they don't work harder, unfortunately, they're often just perceived as not being so bright.
I am curious to understand from like a physical brain neurological standpoint, what's actually happening in your brain if you are developing ADHD? Like what is going on?
So the easiest way to explain it is that with all mental illnesses or, the mental health diagnoses.
Would you call this a mental illness?
It is in DSM-5, and it would be considered a mental illness.
Really?
Or a mental disorder.
Why do we have to call it an illness? Like I take personal offense to that as somebody that has
you and lots of other people.
ADHD. Do they consider dyslexia a mental illness?
Yes, it is a learning disorder. So it's a disorder.
I like to call it difference, but
difference,
okay. Yes. And I know you're talking technically speaking, and you don't think about it this way.
And I don't think about it this way. So,
how do you think about ADHD?
So ADHD in many ways can be simply perceived as neurodiversity. And many people think that it is not an illness or a disorder, that it is potentially a very highly adaptable trait in the right societies, in the right circumstances. And so people with ADHD don't want to sit still. They want to roam and explore and innovate and create and protect and hunt and gather and all of these other things. So they're out, Energizer little bunnies, running around doing all the work. They're the ones who have more confidence, who have energy, who have motivation. Those traits are essential to human survival. We need those people. But when you take somebody who has a good dose of those traits and puts them in a classroom and says, sit still and read for 5 hours, and don't talk out of turn,
I will lose my freaking mind.
and don't move your body.
See, I'm already reacting to the thing that you're telling me to do because it feels like a straitjacket.
It should feel like a straitjacket because your brain, in fact, may be hardwired to be one of those explorers, hunters, gatherers, innovators. Your brain is ready to go out and create and save the tribe.
We can talk all day long about the fact that there are so many benefits and gifts to having something that is neurodivergent in the way that your mind works, whether it's dyslexia that makes you more innovative or creative or whatever. We could go down that road. But what I really want to understand before we talk about your recommendations and the exciting new treatments that are available that you should be considering is what is actually happening in the functioning of your brain when you are somebody that has ADHD or this inability to focus.
The easiest way to explain it is that there are going to be some brain regions that are overactive and some brain regions that are underactive.
Okay.
So brain regions that help people focus and concentrate are likely going to be underactive, meaning that if we compare them to the brains of people who are able to sit still and learn for 5 hours, people with ADHD have differences. So the frontal lobes and the striatum, which is involved somewhat in emotion regulation and other tasks, those seem to be the networks most affected. But the reality is there is no universal brain scan for any mental health, neurodivergent condition. So there's no brain scan that we can do to say whether you have ADHD or don't have ADHD. So it can be highly variable, highly different. So some people might be able to focus on some things. Some people might have hyperactivity, others may not. And depending on who you are and where you live and what society you live in and what people expect of you in that society, those traits might be welcome and admired and respected, or those traits might be vilified and thought of as insubordination or misbehavior.
Well, that was exactly the experience that we had with our son. And I know for you listening, you may have had that experience yourself or know somebody that was the problem kid or always acting out or interrupting or couldn't focus. And it turned out to be this issue around attention. And as a Harvard psychiatrist, when somebody comes into your office and you're meeting with a patient and it's very clear that they have indicators that ADHD is something that they may be struggling with, what is the realm of options that you have at your disposal to help somebody function at a better level or a happier level when they are neurodivergent in this way?
So most people would get a full kind of diagnostic interview and workup. And so we're going to look for any other comorbid disorders like depression, anxiety, other things.
Why would those be comorbid?
So those are very commonly comorbid, actually.
Why?
It turns out that if you have any DSM-5 diagnostic label, you're more likely to have more than one. About 50% of Americans who have one have more than one. And for people who actually seek treatment, on average, people have about 3 to 4 different diagnostic labels. So it means that if you've got ADHD, there's a very high likelihood you might also have dyslexia, like you mentioned, or you might also have an anxiety disorder or depression or bipolar disorder or conduct disorder, but all the way to even more serious neurological conditions like autism spectrum disorder or seizures.
Wow. Dr. Palmer, for the last 30 years, has been researching the connection between food, sleep, exercise, and lifestyle choices and how it impacts your metabolism. And the medical community and mental health community is extraordinarily excited about the fact that you can improve your brain functioning and improve mental wellness by changing your diet, by increasing exercise and prioritizing sleep and getting yourself off of substances that are ruining your health. And so I guess I want to go backwards, because one of the other things that you said in our first conversation was that a root cause of all mental illness and brain misfiring issues is metabolism issues, metabolic issues, that anything mental, everybody, we think from the neck up. Dr. Palmer's like, go from the neck down and let's talk about what you're eating and how you're sleeping and whether or not you're exercising, because that should be part of the treatment. So when you said that ADHD tends to show up before 12, is it showing up because of metabolic reasons?
It almost certainly is.
What does that mean? Because as a busy mom, I was diagnosed late in life like most women. And I was diagnosed as a result of having my son go through the testing process because he was labeled a problem kid in 4th grade. Turns out he couldn't read. Turns out he was highly ADHD. And that made me go, oh, wait a minute. This sounds exactly like me. And then I went through testing and got a formal diagnosis, but I didn't know anything about ADHD. And so talk to the busy mom or dad or concerned aunt or uncle or teacher or caregiver who's like, wait, did he just say metabolic issues like food and exercise and sleep can be a root cause of ADHD?
Yes. There's no question that they play a profound role in our brain function, and that includes our ability to sit still, our ability to pay attention, our ability to learn and concentrate. I don't want anyone to come away from this conversation thinking that if everybody just follows a healthy diet, we will eradicate all ADHD or we will eradicate all other mental health conditions, because that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that if you look at the root cause, we know this from decades of doing brain scans on people. What are those brain scans measuring? They're measuring brain metabolism. When we see brain regions that are underactive or overactive, we mean that they are underactive and overactive in terms of brain metabolism.
What does that mean, brain metabolism?
So brain metabolism is basically blood flow to brain regions that bring food and oxygen so that the cells can create energy or not. And so the simplest way to think about it is if there are brain cells that are not getting enough food and oxygen, they are not going to have enough energy, and they are more likely to malfunction or not function optimally.
So if I can attempt to translate this, you're basically saying that with an ADHD diagnosis, which means that there are parts of my brain, or perhaps your brain as you're listening, that are, quote, under functioning. I've heard it described as like the conductor in your brain that directs your focus and quiets other inputs so that you can pay attention. If my conductor with an ADHD brain is under functioning, to put it in your language, the metabolism in my brain is not getting the energy that is required to that part of my brain for the conductor to work. Is that what you're basically saying?
That is correct.
So what are stimulants doing? Like if somebody, because you go in for ADHD and typically, you get prescribed Adderall or Concerta or some other kind of stimulant, or you're told to drink a cup of coffee. I remember that being like one of the first things they said, well, just give them caffeine in the morning. I'm like, what? Why? What are those pills doing?
So stimulants are increasing a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And that dopamine is actually increasing brain metabolism in those conductor regions of your brain. So when you take a stimulant, you're taking these underactive brain regions or these conductor brain regions, and you're giving them a boost. You are stimulating them, which means stimulating their metabolism, which means giving them more energy so that they work more robustly.
So the drugs that are prescribed for ADHD are just increasing my brain metabolism?
Absolutely. But most people don't think of it that way.
I don't think about it that way.
They think about it as correcting a chemical imbalance.
That's exactly what I thought it was.
And I want people to think about it differently. I want people to think about it as correcting a brain metabolism problem. The reason is not because I am against stimulants. It's not because I'm against effective therapies and treatments. If somebody is taking a stimulant and it is working well for them, by all means, keep doing it. I am all about improving human health, human happiness, human productivity. I am all for it. However, if you understand that this is a metabolic intervention, it gives us additional strategies and options because there are other ways to improve brain metabolism other than stimulant medications. And not everybody does well with stimulants. Some people have bad side effects. Some people can kind of crash and burn toward the end of the day in terms of mood or energy level. For some, that's not a problem, but for others, it's a major problem. And they seriously are crashing every night. For some people, stimulants disrupt their sleep. Even when they only take them in the morning, the kids aren't sleeping well. And now that's wreaking all sorts of havoc. And if you don't sleep well, guess what? That's going to further disrupt your brain metabolism. And
plus a lot of them impact your appetite.
Yes.
And so if you're not actually fueling your body, that also impacts your brain metabolism and the metabolism in your body. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can see my reaction, which is basically my jaw is kind of hanging open because I'm in real time thinking about so many things. Like as a mom, I'm thinking back to the fact that our son, Oakley, was a profoundly picky eater. And if I am being honest with you, Dr. Palmer, I fed that kid chicken nuggets 3 meals a day because it was the only thing that I could get into that kid's mouth. He hated the texture of peanut butter. I tried to sneak crap into the smoothies. And so now I'm sitting here going, oh God, I gave my kid ADHD because I fed him processed crap. And he was not a sports kid and he played a lot of video games and I did this to him. And then I tried to medicate him and they told us you had to have 3 or 4 different types of medication. And I watched him turn into the Hulk when they put him on Vyvanse. And then I watched him drop off the Adderall cliff at the end of the day. And I saw our 12-year-old literally, like I'm going to start crying when I think about this. Like I literally saw like the light going out in him. And thankfully, he's like, I'm not taking this. I'm just not taking this because the only thing that was being offered to us is to keep him in school. You have to medicate him to have him sit still. And it was awful. And you're here to say there's something else you can do? What else can you do?
There are so many things we can do. And I mean, hearing your story and your son's story, it's heartbreaking because I know there are hundreds of thousands of other people, if not millions of other people just like that. There are so many parents who are being told, you must medicate your child in order to keep him in school. He is a problem.
I said that to him too. I was like, you have to take this. Like, it's not an option for you.
The heartbreaking thing is that kids internalize the message that they are a problem. They're not getting the message that there is a problem with your brain metabolism, honey. And this is something we can address. It's not your fault. Your brain metabolism isn't working right. And the evidence for that is your inability to sit still and pay attention and do all these other things. And we can fix this.
Oh, don't you just love hearing a doctor say, we can fix this. And there's a way in which he speaks that I believe him. And let's just take a minute and underline how incredible and ballsy it is for Harvard's Dr. Palmer to say, we can fix ADHD. There's just a little issue in your brain and how it's metabolizing stuff. And as soon as he said that, you know what I did? I was like, I'm in, and I bet you're in too. Well, here's what we got to do. We got to take a quick break to hear a word from our sponsors, because our amazing sponsors help me bring this life-changing information to you at zero cost. But when we come back, you're going to hear how Dr. Palmer says you can improve ADHD with a diet, and he's going to give you the protocol he recommends for anyone struggling with ADHD. So don't you dare go anywhere. I'm going to be waiting for you after a short break. Welcome back. I'm Mel Robbins. I'm so thrilled you're taking the time to listen to this interview that we did here in our Boston studios with Harvard's Dr. Chris Palmer. Now, before the break, Dr. Palmer just shared his belief that the root cause of ADHD is a metabolic issue. And honestly, his argument is making a lot of sense to me. And as I think about my life with ADHD and my kids who have ADHD, I'm really grabbing onto this. And I loved it when he said, you can fix this. So let's get back into the interview, where I'm now starting to connect the dots on just how empowering this is. What's so liberating about this, as I'm processing what you're saying, is that you're right. When you get handed a diagnosis, you think, oh, this just is how it is. I am just somebody that will have anxiety for the rest of my life. I'm somebody that will struggle with ADHD. Oh, I'm dyslexic. It just is what it is. And you're saying that while that may be true right now, the dyslexia, the ADHD, any of these neurodivergent diagnoses that you tend to then have somebody throw medication at you, you're here to say that I completely lost my train of thought because I'm getting so emotional about this, but you're basically here to tell us that it's not is what it is.
It's not a permanent life. It's not a permanent condition. ADHD can be helped. We can help people heal and recover. There are some neurodevelopmental conditions that are permanent and that are likely not, quote unquote, changeable. So people who lack social skills, they don't take a pill and all of a sudden have great social skills. And then when the pill wears off, their social skills go away again. They permanently have a difference in their social skills. That is likely not going to change, even if we change their brain metabolism.
Are you referring to somebody who might be on the autism spectrum?
Yes.
So what will happen, though, if you improve a person who has been diagnosed on the autism spectrum and has difficulty making social connection or reading social cues? What will happen, though, if you improve their metabolism?
So people who are on the spectrum almost always have comorbid DSM diagnostic labels. About 50% will have ADHD. Many of them will have seizures. 60% will have depression and anxiety symptoms. Most of them have OCD symptoms because they're embedded into the diagnostic criteria for autism. A study just came out 2 weeks ago. 10% will go on to develop schizophrenia.
Wow.
People with autism have essentially higher rates of all of the mental health conditions. So although we may not be able to change their social skills, if we improve their brain metabolism, we can improve many of those other symptoms. We can reduce their ADHD symptoms. We can improve their capacity to learn. We can improve their mood and energy, reduce their anxiety, make them feel better, think better, be more positive, have more energy. It can make profound differences in their lives if we intervene early enough before social skill development is complete.
And what age is that?
The earlier, the better. So social skills start developing from birth. If we know that there are problems, the sooner we can intervene with brain metabolism strategies, we might be able to reduce symptoms or improve symptoms or modify the course of illness. But after childhood, people have either learned social skills or they haven't, or they've learned different social skills. It's not that it's all or nothing, but there are differences. And those differences are going to be difficult, if not impossible, to change. And we shouldn't expect to change them.
I would imagine if you achieve a reduction of feelings of depression or bouts of anxiety, that, though, makes somebody feel remarkably better, even if they're not connecting socially with people. You know what I'm saying?
No doubt about it. And let me be clear, there are many people who are autistic who have tremendous strengths and invaluable traits to the human species. Some of our most notable geniuses, billionaire businessmen, and others are supposedly on the spectrum. And we as a society would not be thriving in the ways that we are if we didn't have Albert Einstein, if we didn't have other current ones, I won't name names, but other current ones who have self-disclosed that they have received that label when they were young. Because sometimes it comes with benefits. It doesn't always, though. There are people who are on the spectrum who have to live in group homes, who are unable to care for themselves, who are having seizures, who have profound cognitive impairment, who are injuring themselves repetitively. And I believe that using metabolic treatment strategies, we can help those people. We can help those people live better lives, maybe live more independently, function at a higher level.
I'm intrigued by the fact that you said that ADHD is not a condition that you're stuck with forever, because I have believed that it is. And I have brought that into marriage counseling multiple times. Like, I'm sorry, honey, I'm just going to leave my Kleenexes on the counter, and my vanity in the bathroom is always going to look like somebody shot all of my makeup out of a cannon right on top of the sink. Like, I am forgetful, all of that stuff. I've thought there was no hope, but you're saying there is. So how does improving my brain metabolism help with either inattention or hyperactivity?
It helps with both. So improving brain metabolism is about helping those brain regions that are underactive become more active. And at the same time, if there are brain regions that are overactive, it helps them normalize their activity so that they aren't hyper excitable or overactive. At the end of the day, in a very practical, concrete way, to someone like you, I would first ask the question, do you really want to change?
No.
And so,
well, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what it would feel like to be me if I didn't have ADHD as part of my identity. And maybe what I'm realizing as I'm talking to you in this confessional, Dr. Palmer, is that I use it as an excuse to not have to pay attention, to not have to slow down, to be responsible for the fact that I am a little bit chaotic, both internally in my thoughts and externally. And if I'm being honest, I know that if I work out, for example, and it's one of those workouts where somebody's yelling at you and you're really going for it, and you get that kind of chemical rush that Dr. John Rady, probably one of your colleagues, calls miracle grow for the brain, that I have the same experience of being able to hyper focus for about an hour and a half after I exercise, as if I had taken Adderall.
Which is perfect. So,
but I don't want to have to exercise like that every morning, but it's easier to take an Adderall.
No, well, and again,
I'm just being honest.
So both of those are strategies to address brain metabolism. So you're using effective strategies, a stimulant and exercise, both of those are directly influencing your brain metabolism. You are noticing some benefit. I want to come back to the bigger question that I asked you. Do you want to change? Because at the end of the day,
I want to stop feeling frustrated. And I think when I was younger, and certainly watching our son struggle, you do feel like there's something wrong with you. I see a direct connection between the undiagnosed ADHD and the inability for me to either pay attention in class or focus when I needed to focus, and the fact that mentally I just felt like there was something wrong with me, and anxiety started to develop, and that became the overriding thing that I felt and that people could see. And so I was medicated for anxiety for 25 years until I got this diagnosis around ADHD. And I'm like, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't anxiety as the core issue after all. Maybe it was this inability to focus. And what you're actually offering is a deeper epiphany that maybe it's not actually ADHD. Maybe it's my brain metabolizes differently than other people. And when I pay attention to that in myself or in our son, because he doesn't take medication, he has not taken medication since he was 13. He changed his diet. He's more active. It's as if his entire brain changed.
that's a perfect example of what I'm here to say. So at the end of the day, you are going to be hard pressed to convince me that your ADHD has ruined or impaired your life. You are a ridiculously successful woman who has a full life with a family, a career, impact. And I would never want you to think that your ADHD has stood in the way. Your ADHD symptoms may be the reason you have achieved as much as you have. And so although the teachers may have said, this is bad, stop behaving this way, smarten up, read faster, what's wrong with you? Why didn't you comprehend that book the way everybody else did? Why can't you sit still? Why are you always trying to show off? Why are you always looking for attention? Now, those very traits may actually be what are fueling your success. And I would really hate to see you medicate away your success so that you can become a mediocre human being.
What? Dr. Palmer.
We don't want that.
Wow.
So,
well, I'm on the other side of it. So let's also put into context, I'm now 55 and I have been utilizing medication. And what's interesting is I only take it in environments where I think I need it. Like I didn't take medication this morning because I knew that we would be doing this interview, and being in an environment with lights on and microphones, I feel so focused because my adrenaline is going that the metabolism is probably different than if I'm just trying to get stuff done around the house. And so I want to go back though to somebody who feels like their inability to pay attention or their inability to be still is causing anxiety. It is creating a ruckus in their life because having practiced for 30 years, you have seen plenty of people where ADHD is not fueling their success because it's out of control.
I'm pulling a reversal and checking in on Mel, who has been an absolute beast trying to write this book. So let's go see what's going on.
How's your book coming?
Oh my God, Chris. I can't believe that you're here. I have had the biggest freaking breakthrough of my life. I have a dyslexic ADHD brain. I am riddled with feelings of inferiority and like this story that I am never going to get this book done. It's not going to be great. It's not going to help you. It has created such writer's block. I've had the biggest breakthrough of my life. I'm going to share with you the secret technique that has unlocked writer's block and created a flow of content. So what I've noticed is being dyslexic, being ADHD, being somebody that is a speaker by nature, I have a hard time getting my thoughts on paper. So I just had this huge breakthrough that I want you to steal. I realized, Chris, that I've been trying to write my book on my laptop. And yes, I've been dictating some of the parts of the book. What do you think? Are you part of this video? I have been dictating on my laptop. This morning, I had the world's biggest breakthrough. I want you to steal this. I sat down. I have my iPad here. Come here. And I went to go start to write the introduction to my new book. I went to start to type, and I hate typing on this thing. So I went to look for my little wireless keyboard, Chris. I didn't have it. So I was forced to use the dictate button. Now, here's the cool thing about using the dictate button on the iPad is what happens is you start to dictate, and then you can use your finger to tap where you're needing to go. And if I don't like what I just dictated, on my laptop, I would delete it. On this, I'm like, F it. I just hit the dictate button and I keep going. I have literally banged out the introduction to my new book in 11 minutes flat. Do you realize I've been trying to write this for a month? And I think it has to do with the fact that when I put on the hat to type, and to move a cursor, it's a different part of my brain than the brain that creates the content. And by simply using an iPad where I can see this and I can touch stuff and I can move it around and then boom, I go like this and now I got something to say. So I touch it here and then I hit return and I'm like, oh, so I have this thing that I want to say right here and I'm not even thinking about it. I'm just letting this fly out of my mouth. It's unbelievable. I'm literally writing my book as I'm talking to you. And what I've realized about my mind is there is something that happens in my mind when I go from thinking a thought and trying to type it out or write it out. The second that I have to organize it with a keyboard and a mouse, I lose all creative focus. I think I'm going to get this book written literally in the next week. I'm so liberated. Please steal this idea. And let me know if it works for you, if it works for your kids that are struggling with homework to dictate like this. Don't use a keyboard, an iPad, a smartphone. You can do it on a computer too with like a tracking pad. I am just so happy I've figured this out.
So I just wanted to check in on you because there's a lot going on right now. I was sitting at my desk yesterday and I got the news that Stephen Twitch Boss had died from suicide. And if you have not seen this news or you don't know who he is, let me just kind of share a little bit about him and why it impacted me. So he was best known, and this is how I knew him, for being one of the executive producers of Ellen DeGeneres' talk show. And he was not only an executive producer, he was on that show every single day, 5 days a week. He was the DJ. He would do all the dance parties with Ellen. He has this huge, amazing megawatt smile and his energy. He's just one of those people that you didn't need to know him to know that literally positivity, dancing, spreading like kindness. That's what this guy was all about. And you didn't need to know him to know that he was also all about his wife, Allison, and his 3 like gorgeous kids. And during the pandemic, not only was he there with Ellen, but he and his wife, who are both dancers, started doing all of these choreographed, awesome videos that went viral online. And they spread so much joy for people doing these dances and teaching people with their kids all these dance moves. And they just were this positive, amazing force. And so when I heard the news that he died from suicide yesterday at the age of 40, it just rocked me to my core. And I'm still processing it like 18 hours later. And when I woke up this morning, I also saw that I had missed the fact that yesterday was the 10th anniversary of Sandy Hook. And so I just felt this need to grab my coffee and to run up here. I haven't even washed my face yet this morning and talk to you. And I just wanted to share what I'm thinking and feeling, because I think it's really important that in moments like this, where the news feels overwhelming or the world feels overwhelming, and I know the holidays can just bring up a lot of stuff for a lot of us too, I want to check in on you. And I want to check in on myself. And so that's why I decided I'm just going to get on this mic and I'm going to just talk to you. And that's it. That's what we're doing today. So first things first, let's unpack, or I want to share with you what I'm thinking in the wake of learning that somebody that was so light and positive and amazing on the outside, how do you process that kind of news that they died from suicide? And notice the word I'm using. I'm saying died from suicide. And that's because I think about a death from mental health struggles the same way I think about a death from cancer. Like if you have a friend that dies of brain cancer, you say they died from cancer. If you have a friend or a loved one, as every single one of us does, who has died from a struggle with addiction or depression or trauma or toxic stress or any other mental health issue, that mental health challenge deteriorated the physical structure of that person's brain. That's what happened. The same way that brain cancer physically deteriorates the brain until it kills somebody. And so the word choice is really deliberate because it's a recognition of what actually happened. There's a couple other bigger things that I just have to say, and that is that you don't need to know somebody. Like you don't need to know Twitch personally to be affected personally by the news of his death. You don't have to have lived in the Sandy Hook community to be impacted by the news that it was the 10th anniversary yesterday. Because these things that are happening out in the world trigger you to remember experiences of loss in your own life. And so for me personally, I think one of the reasons why I have been so rocked by this news is because, you know, if you look at somebody like Twitch on the outside, this man exuded positivity. You never saw him without a smile on his face. You couldn't watch those dance videos without feeling the ripple of joy. And for me personally, it reminds me of a really dear friend of mine that died from suicide over 10 years ago. And the second that I heard this news about somebody who on the outside looked like they were just doing great, it reminded me of losing somebody that was the same way. And that may be happening to you. And the other thing that this is bringing up for me is that you just have no clue what's going on in somebody else's life. You focus on the beautiful smile that somebody has, or the great job, or the bank account, or the awesome spouse, or the wonderful kids, or the big house. But people don't live at their house. You know where everybody lives? They live inside their heads. And you and I don't have a clue what it's like for somebody else to live with the pain inside their heads. And so, you know, one of the major takeaways here for me is one of Twitch's biggest messages, which is being kind. And the fact that being kind and being positive around other people, you have no clue. In fact, we underestimate the impact that it can have on somebody else's life to just be kind to them. And so that's one takeaway, that you just don't have a clue. So please just don't assume that you know what's going on and assume that everybody is silently battling something So it's on all of us to be kind to one another. Second thing that I want to say is I need you to be kind to yourself today, because there's a lot swirling around right now. And so if you notice that you're thinking about people that you lost, which I am. I mean, yesterday what was happening for me as I heard the news, and I, of course, immediately thought about his family, is I was transported back to the day that I learned that our dear friend Fred had died from suicide. And it's like I started reliving that day again. As I thought about the pain that Twitch's wife, Allison, and his 3 kids were feeling, I thought about this particular moment on the day that Fred died, where I was with his daughter and we were walking up the front steps to his house. And I knew that when we opened that door, I was going to be present when she learned that her father had died. It is a moment that changed me forever. And so that's also what was happening for me yesterday. And I was thinking about, how much I miss Fred. And I was thinking about how sad and heartbroken I am about all the other people in my life that had struggled with mental health issues and addiction or hopelessness or depression, and how they all died from suicide, and just how much pain there is out there. It can be really overwhelming. If that's happening for you, just be kind to yourself. Like, you may need to sleep in. You may need to go for a walk today. You should probably reach out to a friend and talk to somebody about it. It would be good for you to remember the person and the things that you miss about them. Like remembering somebody that is gone and thinking about the things that you really loved about them. That's a really healthy thing to do on a day like today. But simply being aware that news like this brings up stuff for you that's personal, that's step 1. Step 2 is being kind to yourself. Step 3 is being proactive about taking care of yourself today and reaching out. And step 4 is understanding this issue in a larger context. And so now I want to kind of switch gears and address something that's pissing me off. As I see people processing Twitch's death in particular, because this hit me as hard as Robin Williams, as hard as Anthony Bourdain. And I think the reason why it hits people so hard is because you're trying to make sense of somebody who seems like they've got it all together on the outside. And it, in your rational mind, it just makes no sense. And that is where the learning is. See, your mind is rational right now. You're objective. You're not living with the pain the person was living with. So when you look at the situation from your lens, you remove the pain that the person was feeling. And so it makes no sense to your brain because your brain wasn't compromised from the mental health struggle that that person was really battling day in and day out. And so let me go back to the example of brain cancer. If you have a friend that's dying from brain cancer, you see them deteriorate on the outside. You see what's happening. You would never in a million years, when somebody dies from brain cancer, go, oh, that's so selfish. Why did they choose to do that? What about their family? But they had so many resources. But I see so many people writing this horse shit online, and it's pissing me off because it shows that you don't have a freaking clue what it means to struggle with a mental health issue. You don't have a freaking clue. And it really pisses me off when I see people that write really arrogant, pretentious things like, well, I struggled, I was in a dark thing, and I asked for help. Well, that's great. I'm happy that you didn't get so bad, that your brain wasn't so deteriorated, that you could ask for help. When somebody gets to the point that their brain functioning is so eroded that they cannot cognitively, rationally process the fact that there is a huge difference between ending the pain that you're dealing with and ending your life. When somebody gets to the point where they can't think clearly It means the physical structure of their brain has deteriorated from the mental health battle. That's what that means. And that smile that people put on their faces the whole way through, that is so hard. Can you imagine to get to the point where you love your family so much that you think the only way to save them is to get rid of yourself? Like, this is just, that's how compromised your brain is. And so when I think about this like brain cancer, that the physical brain functioning is deteriorating to the point where nobody can think rationally, that removes all judgment. And all I have is compassion and sadness. That's it. That is it. And that is all there is to have for the people that you've lost, for the folks that we continue to lose, and for anybody that's listening to this. If this is you and you're in a really dark place right now, I want to speak directly to you right now. Because you're meant to hear this right now. You can address the pain that you're feeling in your mind and your body. You can. And there are people standing by right now that are trained, that want to help you. And with support and with small, tiny moves forward every single day, you can make this pain lessen. You can loosen the grip it has on you. And you can feel better. You can also improve the physical structure of your brain. You can improve the way that you think so that your brain starts to support you. You can face this with a little bit of support. You can. And you can do that, and I want you to do that because we want you here. You have a big, beautiful life, and I know that if you believed that you could somehow lessen the pain you're feeling, you would want to live that life. And so please, please, please get support for the pain that you're feeling and hold on to the life that you have, because your life is worth fighting for. And there are people that want to help you. We have resources in the show notes, not only for here in the United States, but also for multiple languages, international resources. And so I just felt the need to talk to you, to check in with you. Be kind to yourself today. Stop assuming that you know what other people are thinking. Remember the people that you've lost and the things that you loved about them. And together, we'll get through this. We will. I promise.
Hey, it's Mel. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoyed that video, by God, please subscribe because I don't want you to miss a thing. Thank you so much for being here. We've got so much amazing stuff coming. Thank you so much for sending this stuff to your friends and your family. I love you. We create these videos for you. So make sure you subscribe. Mwah.